All right. Well, I think we have a lot of folks joining and just want to go ahead and get us started so we have enough time for everyone in this wonderful panel to discuss an overview of qualitative data collection today. So I'd like to thank actually the MCHRI Education Committee who helps to organize all of these events. You can see the members of the committee here on the slide. So thanks so much for your work. And then also would like to announce that there's an inaugural Stanford Medicine Children's Health Research Community event that's coming up in June, on June 13th. And so this will be a wonderful event where you'll learn more about resources related to research focused on Stanford Medicine Children's Health. You can see the registration link right there where you can go and register and find more information. It looks like there's also some great gifts. Next slide. And then also just a shout out for the 7th annual MCHRI Symposium, which will be taking place on October 24th, 2024. You can see that the submission for the abstracts will open up this summer, so keep an eye out for that. And the abstracts will be due in September 2024. And you can see the great speakers we have listed here. They'll be focusing on information and disinformation in maternal and child health, and it looks like it'll be an excellent session. And then another event to keep an eye out for is Monday, June 3rd. We have another MCHRI seminar focused on studying human embryo implantation. So that's something else to register for as well. And that will also be virtual. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers here today. As I mentioned, they're going to be focused on giving you an overview of qualitative data collection with a specific emphasis on interview and focus group methodologies, as well as how you can use those research findings for impact as well. And so I'd like to introduce the speakers. So Dr. Janine Bruce, you could see is listed on the slide and also here in the Zoom boxes. She's the Associate Director for the Office of Child Health Equity. She's also co-director of the Scholarly Concentration in Community Health for the School of Medicine, as well as co-director of the Scholarly Concentration in Community Engagement and Advocacy for the Department of Pediatrics. And so she has excellent expertise in qualitative research, as our other panelists here as well. We also have Dr. Shazeen Suleman. She is co-director of community engagement in the Office of Child Health Equity, and also co-director of the Scholarly Concentration in Community Engagement and Advocacy with Dr. Bruce in the Department of Pediatrics. And last but not least, we have Dr. Sylvia Merrell. She is also co-director of Scholarly Concentration in Medical Education in the School of Medicine. So these individuals, in addition to discussing the qualitative data collection today, they're a great resource to go to if you have future grant opportunities or questions about qualitative research. So with that, I will leave it to them.
Thank you. And I think Sylvia is going to share slides for us. So I'm really excited to welcome you all to this presentation. And as we get started, it's important that we begin by acknowledging where we're all joining from. So we're joining today from unceded Ohlone territory. And I think it's especially important when we think about doing the work that we're doing in qualitative, which is really rooted in understanding experience and constructing knowledge together, that we recognize that many of the people that we are seeing, many of them have their own stories of trauma and migration. And some of the people that we're supporting, including the people that I work with who are migrants, have been displaced from their ancestral territories, but I'm only able to help them because now I am a guest on land because people have been displaced from their ancestral lands. And as we begin, please, it's so important that we recognize our positionality, especially for those of us that are non-Indigenous, of how intimately tied our work needs to be with reconciliation with Indigenous communities. So next slide. So today we're hoping that you can learn a whirlwind tour of qualitative research data collection methods. There are several, but we're going to focus specifically on interviews and focus group methods. We'll talk a little bit about some best practices for data collection, resources, and how you prepare your materials by using frameworks, how to prepare interview guides, and how to think about preparing for your analysis. And I will be sharing with you some perspectives from myself as an MCHRI grantee regarding what I've learned through my own experiences with respect to qualitative data collection. And we hope we'll be able to have an opportunity to hear from you as the wider group. So as we get started, we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Please use your name and pronouns. I use she, her pronouns, your division, and maybe a word or an emoji or something to describe why you're interested in this seminar. Maybe it's a project you're doing, or maybe it's knowledge that you're interested in learning, or if you have specific questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful co-presenter, Sylvia, to talk about frameworks and reflexivity, which is so important when you do this kind of work.
Thank you, Shazeen. It's wonderful to be here and be able to discuss this with everybody today. And thank you for starting off our presentation, grounding us into where we are. And it actually really leads the way into me talking about conceptual frameworks and reflexivity. So let's think about what is a conceptual framework or theoretical framework. It is a big picture potential idea that helps ground you as you move your study from your start to your finish. It's a specific approach to thinking about a research problem. It gives you a lens, and it allows you to focus on an area that you would want to focus on and utilize those the resources available to you in that way. The conceptual framework is usually represented as a diagram or a process map that shows relationships or processes between various concepts as you're aiming to address those issues and identify those ideas that you're aiming to research. They're usually derived from related concepts, which could either be conceptual or practical in nature. It could be something that you're drawing from existing theories, historical or even more contemporary. But the benefit of using a conceptual theoretical framework is that you are able to utilize a shared language. You're not redefining these concepts. They are present, others know about it, other academics are speaking in that same shared language, and you're drawing from those ideas as you embark on your research study overall. All these frameworks are based on key concepts. And like I said, in terms of these diagrams, they might emphasize or show bigger domains or even specific variables of interest that you might want to study and show relationships across. And both relationships, it might mean qualitatively, or if you're embarking on mixed method studies, quantitatively. Why I bring this up is that these conceptual frameworks are a tool that you can utilize to help guide and focus your study from the very beginning upon inception along the pathway to data collection. And we'll be talking about how are we designing our data collection instruments later on in this session. And so you can really lean into them and ensure that you're able to collect the information that you're needed, as well as later on in terms of how you present your findings overall. It guides your study from start to finish. Next slide, please. This is an example of a pretty elaborate conceptual framework. In fact, there's 2 or 3 conceptual frameworks embedded in here. In the middle, we can see a social ecological framework where we position, where we think about who we're studying and how we're studying the concepts of interest. We're starting from the inside, the inner circle. We have the people, individual people, their families, where they are within their community, and then where they are in the general population overall. But you can see at the top there, we have great potential domains of interest if we're interested in looking at community energy and balance in terms of this framework. We can look at cultural and contextual influences in terms of how the questions of interest might be applied to those. We can consider utilizing conceptual frameworks in gathering information such as key demographic data, as shown here in this diagram here. And we can also look at the inner diagram, the social ecological framework, looking at how these agents might be useful for you in terms of the study. They could be key stakeholders. They could be people within the community who might provide access into new participants or new resources as well. The domains of interest here in this conceptual framework also provide you opportunities in terms of what target interventions people might appreciate or might be considering, and you might ask some of these questions as you design your qualitative instruments. And you might also look at policy guidelines as well. So in this instance, we're looking at a framework that this research team has combined because they identified multiple dimensions of interest. And they wanted to make sure and ensure that the domains of interest that they're wanting to collect data on are represented both in their data collection instruments and guides along the pathway of their analysis, as well as in terms of how they present their findings. Thank you. Next slide. And as we look at how conceptual frameworks, which are external ideas, they come from elsewhere, we also need to consider where we're coming from in terms of researchers ourselves. And an important element in qualitative research is this element of reflexivity. And so we're talking about impacting factors and things to consider as we're looking at reflexivity of ourselves. So we have personal factors, our own identities, and having an awareness of our own biases in terms of where we come from. And these are often influenced by the contextual factors, how where we are positioned within our communities or within the research arena, how this might impact the broader context of research and how the research itself might be situated and what is going on locally at those sites. As Shazeen has alluded to, there are definitely historical factors at play that we need to consider, historical legacies, as well as how the changing shape of social identity and social phenomena might be impacting how we're researching, who we're researching with, and how we're able to identify some information that could be really vital to these communities. Of course, let's not forget about cultural factors at play, understanding our own cultural assumptions, as well as any cultural differences between ourselves, others on our research team, but more importantly, the people that we're learning information from. And all this to say, qualitative research comes with subjectivity, and we must understand our own positionality, where we have our own experiences, our own growth in learning how to do research, but also interfacing with the community. So it's important to really self-examine where we come from and how this impacts the research process. Next slide, please. This is a conceptual framework showing reflexivity. So if we're thinking about reflexivity and is it related to the characteristics of our research study, we have this bubble of this reflexive space that we're allowed to give ourselves as we embark on designing our research projects. We can reflect our own epistemology and how we consider and how we know how we learn and how that is contextualized, and that might be impacted by the theoretical and conceptual frameworks that we know about or utilize in our own research studies. We learn about, in terms of reflexivity of the research design, learning about boundaries within ourselves and also within the communities, boundaries of relevant sources that are available to us that could really impact how we consider and reach out in terms of designing our methodological approaches. And then finally, thinking about practice, how we do data collection and how we do analysis has implications in how we do our own research practices. Next slide. And so we're thinking about qualitative data collection methods. There's different approaches that you can take. So we are considering, this is just as a short list that we have here in terms of how we can collect information and data, and each of these have their pros and cons. So the majority of the time we use in the work that I do is interviews, focus groups, case studies, or open-ended survey questions that are attached to closed-ended survey questions. But there's other less commonly used ones, and we have resources available to us towards the end on how to do observations, document analysis, photo voice, and other means to collect information overall. So next slide. And more specifically, as we tee off into the next part of our presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the comparisons and contrasts between focus groups and in-depth interviews. So as we know, we use focus groups when we want to have this group interaction. The group interaction itself might stimulate conversation and responses. We are aiming to get a greater breadth of information from our participants, a wide range of information, but we may not be able to ask as many questions or as in-depth or personal questions along the way. It is sometimes logistically more feasible to assemble groups of people together if they're already assembling. So we might choose to do focus groups in those instances. However, we might want to use in-depth interviews when the group setting may not be comfortable for everyone and it would inhibit the responses, such as a sensitive subject matter or peer pressure. We might want to have a greater depth of understanding on a topic, and so those one-on-one conversations might be more useful for that. It's logistically feasible to have these interactions overall. It might be easier to reach them by phone or schedule during other appointments that they might have. But it's sort of something for you to consider as we move forward and thinking about interviews and focus groups for your data collection.
So I will be introducing you to interviews, and interviews are really, for many of us who are clinicians, and anyone who does any kind of clinical practice, in a way, taking a history is a little bit like an interview, because you're doing an interactive collection of collecting their participant perspectives and detailed experiences. Now, I'm very careful when I said in a way, because it doesn't actually translate, but it's a way for clinical folks to kind of get their heads around it. And we can use interviews to, like Sylvia said, to clarify meaning. So if you have gotten some quantitative data and you want to understand or get a little bit more color or why or how this landed for you, you can get that perspective, share results, and see how the results actually land with that individual. Do a lot of exploration. Qualitative work, and particularly interviews, can be really helpful when you're in the formative stage of a study. And as Sylvia said, there's pros and cons for different interview types, as I'm going to share with you on the next slide, that the way you set up your interview can lead to different outcomes. And like much of qualitative research, interviews exist on a continuum. And I think of this continuum from completely unstructured, which is the most like free-flowing conversation. That can be very useful when you're trying to establish trust, but it does give you the least amount of interviewer control. An example of that kind of question could be if I'm doing a study, and for those of you who know me, I'm really interested in the experiences of migrant children, particularly unaccompanied migrant youth, with accessing healthcare if they have special healthcare needs. So in that vein, and a way I might ask that question in a very unstructured way would be like, tell me about your health. It's a super open-ended question. It can go in multiple different directions. The definition of what is health is left up to the actual participant. Then, however, if you go a little bit more structured, which is what we would call a semi-structured interview, it allows for an open-ended conversation around a specific topic. And it's often the method that I use the most actually in my research. And so thinking about the same topic that I shared with you, an example of an open-ended topic, an open-ended question around a topic might be, walk me through your typical process for how you get to see a doctor, or how do you pay for healthcare? So it's still an open-ended question, but it's now I'm giving a little bit more structure for what I want the information about. And lastly, the most structured kind of question is almost like reading out a questionnaire. Do you have Medicaid? Yes or no? When did you register for Medicaid? Tell me that specific date. It gives you the most amount of control, but you're going to get much more limited flexibility and much more limited depth or thickness of answers, which I will explain on the next slide. So recognizing that this is a 1 hour or 1.5 hour seminar, and we can't possibly teach you everything you need to know about interviews, things that you might want to think about for a successful interviewer is, number one, who your interviewer is going to really determine what you get out of it. If you have an unskilled interviewer, then you are going to get poor data out. And what that means is someone who is skilled with how to ask questions. It requires a lot of preparation. This might be the ability to to be able to listen to what the interviewee is saying and be able to frame questions in a way that are open-ended and still get at the question that you're seeking to explore. And also nonverbal communication. So, for example, what that means is not interrupting a person who is getting interviewed, learning how to encourage someone to keep talking. My favorite is called the silent probe, which is the silent nod and keep on talking. It's encouraging someone to keep talking. Also looking at another way to probe someone to keep talking is, instead of saying, oh, right, or wow, that's such a great point, and then interjecting with what you want to say. That can be something I see a lot in unskilled interviewers who are first learning how to interview, that it's very hard to stay attuned to what the interviewee is saying and also focus on the questions that you want to answer. And along with that, you also want to choose the right interviewee. When I think about qualitative research, often what we're looking for are people who can give us what we call thick descriptions, a nice juicy quote that really encapsulates whatever theme or that you're trying to explore. You might not want to interview someone who answers in one-word sentences, or is not really engaged in that topic, or can't answer anything about your question because they don't have the right context. And so a little bit different from perhaps quantitative data collection is you're often very intentional about who you are interviewing. Where you do your interview really matters as well. I've certainly done interviews over the phone. I've done interviews in refugee shelters, in people's houses, in clinics. And some of that is because of the patients that I work with. But in an ideal circumstance, you want it to be quiet without interruptions. One of my favorite interviews was when I was interviewing a parent of a patient who had a child with a disability, and the child at that moment decided to take off all their clothes and run around through the interview room. That was definitely not an example of of the best interview environment, because we had a lot of interruptions and it was hard to kind of get back on track. When you think about setting up for your interview, you also want to make sure you are not asking too many questions, because it doesn't allow you to get into the depth of the questions that you want to get into. My general rule of thumb is I think about maybe 2 to 3 major topics or general umbrellas and have a few questions in each, but you might want to consider having probes or sub-questions to encourage that person to share more. And lastly, as we'll hear about a little bit more, it can be really helpful to have another person there to record the interview and to take notes. Note-taking is useful for 2 purposes. One, if the recording fails, you still have someone to take notes. And secondly, also to record things that cannot be captured in an audio recording. For example, you can't capture hand gestures, you can't capture facial expressions, you can't capture animation. And when you transcribe that, you really want a way to capture that, because someone saying, my healthcare was good, which will look as the same words on paper, is really different than someone saying, my healthcare was good. You hear that there's a really different level of expression. So I'm going to now, that's a little bit of a quick and high level overview of interviews, and I'm going to pass the baton on to Janine to talk to us about focus groups.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thanks, Shazeen. So I'm going to be the complement to interviews. I'm going to talk about focus groups. So, kind of as Sylvia discussed when she was contrasting both of these approaches, is focus groups are really great because it's a very interactive form of data collection among multiple participants. So you get that wide range of perspectives and experiences, but again, you won't get the level of depth that you might get in an interview. So a lot of ways to consider using a focus group. Oftentimes people are wanting that group interaction. They're wanting that to stimulate the conversation. They want to hear lots of perspectives versus focusing in on just one individual. Sometimes people might think, well, I need a little bit of both. So I think as Shazeen mentioned, you can combine approaches. You may want to consider starting with a focus group and then moving on to interviews with either a subset or those same participants. The other thing that's unique in a focus group is you really have the opportunity to observe what's happening, to observe those group dynamics, the interactions between people, the subtleties of what's happening as well. And so that, going back to Shazeen's point about the importance of a note taker, particularly in a focus group, I would say it's absolutely important, if you can have a note taker, to be able to capture some of the subtle observations of what's happening among participants. Now, we could talk about focus groups and facilitating focus groups for such a long time, but I wanted to highlight a few things that I like to consider when thinking about a focus group and how to structure the organization. I think people are pretty familiar with the idea of having a very free flow format.
Green for a second.
One second. Can I hope? Okay. Sylvia, thumbs up. Can you see everything okay? Great. My apologies. I think most people are very familiar with the free flow format. This is very typical. It allows for the natural group dynamics to play out. It does require a little bit more facilitation on the part of the facilitator because you've got to really manage those group dynamics. You can see from the circles here, you might have some participants that are going to be uber talkers, and you're going to have medium talkers, and then you're going to have folks that you really are going to need to encourage to participate and speak. Now, I want to mention the round the room. That's what Sylvia and I call it, option. This would be where you have the opportunity for each participant to speak. I would not recommend this for every question in your focus group because you would absolutely not get through every question. But in certain instances, maybe you have one, maybe two questions that you really want to allow the opportunity to have a structured question that everybody has the opportunity to briefly reflect on. So the pros are that you get a little participation from everybody. It would be a structured question, and it would allow for something that we call content analysis down the line, where you can do some quasi-quantification of your qualitative findings. Now, the issue is that it would be very time-consuming to get through everyone, depending on the size of the group. And I have been in situations where we were trying to employ this technique for one question, and the dominant speaker started us off, and then some of the subsequent speakers that were a little bit more hesitant would be like, yeah, what that person said. So even though you try, sometimes you can't always achieve what you hope to achieve. Okay. So I think Shazeen mentioned really the importance of having a very thoughtful interviewer. The same is true for a focus group moderator. They really need to understand the purpose and the topic of the study overall and the research question. They need to be someone who is very comfortable with speaking, and particularly with the group. I was just meeting with some community partners yesterday, and we were talking about maybe co-facilitating between somebody on the Stanford side and a parent who knows the families well and has a lot of trust in the community. But at the same time, you want to have somebody that's a good facilitator and can really facilitate versus impose his or her own ideas and biases. You don't want to have somebody that would interject a power differential potentially into the conversation. So think very carefully about who might be the right moderator. I think it's really important to have a trained qualitative, having somebody that's trained in qualitative data collection. Sometimes I will work with community partners in the work I do, and so we do a little mini training to help them understand how we're using open-ended questions, how we're using kind of the range of questions as Shazeen mentioned, and then also telling them the challenges of having closed-ended questions and what it might result in terms of the analysis if you end up asking a lot of very closed-ended questions. As Shazeen mentioned, the importance of pausing and clarifying as needed. So there's a lot of training that can be helpful, particularly if somebody is less familiar with facilitating a focus group. All right, I want to talk a little bit about how to manage those focus groups. I'm certainly not an expert, but it is to some degree an art. You have to think about how you're going to manage your participants. You may have, as we saw a couple slides ago, you may have those experts or very influential people in your group. Sometimes it can be, you know, a gentle redirection, friendly reminders that you appreciate everyone's opinion and everybody is an expert on that topic, but that can kind of redirect and give other people a chance to chime in. So, you know, on a practical level, some things that you can do to, in a nice way, redirect the conversation is limiting eye contact, shifting your gaze to away from a dominant talker or somebody who might be rambling to somebody maybe that you haven't heard chime in. And with those quiet and shy respondents, sometimes you might need to give them a little encouragement to speak. So you can direct your eye contact to them. You can ask them and give them the opportunity to speak. You might say, Sarah, you haven't had a chance to say anything. What do you think? And sometimes that's all that they might need to get engaged more in the conversation. Now, you could have somebody who's very inattentive on their phone and you really want to hear their perspective, so maybe redirecting by calling their name or repeating the question. Now, you might have an instance where you need to set the stage regarding some worries about disrespectful comments or personal attacks or whatnot. So ways that you can anticipate that is think about ahead of time about the group dynamics, laying down the groundwork ahead of time before you even start data collection. But if this comes up during data collection, you can also, you know, kind of gently remind people about kind of the focus of the session and how we can redirect it back to sharing and respecting everybody's comments. Now, there can be a lot of other things to consider in a focus group. So we have some supplemental slides that we'll share with the PDF that will go out after this presentation, but really thinking a little bit more about some of the fundamentals of memoing, strategies for note-taking, so continuation of the things that Shazeen mentioned, also some common facilitation challenges, the role of a co-moderator, and then some additional tips on training and training facilitators and co-moderators. All right, so in summary, really find the approach that best works with to answer your research question. Make sure you're approaching your data collection in a way that you're going to really be able to hear from the right participants and collect the most appropriate data. And then finally, really think about, you know, of the method and approach you choose, make sure that you're going to be able to increase the credibility of your findings overall, because some strategies aren't going to really best answer your question, which will ultimately impact your findings down the line. All right, so I'm going to just continue right through and I'm going to talk about just a few tips around best practices for data collection and then developing question guides. So a couple things to consider, you know, where might you get these questions? How might you develop them? It is different from doing a quantitative survey development, but think about your primary study questions and objectives. Again, make sure that your questions are best answered through open-ended questions. Think about the types of questions that you might ask. Typically, people will ask questions around perceptions, experiences, knowledge, attitudes, and so forth. Think about what your sources might be. And this can be challenging because you may not be able to look to the literature necessarily as you would a survey to find something that's easily adaptable or modifiable, or even you could use it in whole with permission from, you know, authors. However, you know, more and more qualitative researchers and journals are asking for researchers to publish their study questions. And if those aren't available, you can always reach out to the study authors and ask them to share their interview guide or focus group guide. And by and large, people are very open to sharing with attribution. And again, when you're thinking about your question development, sometimes the questions you might ask would be more amenable to an interview versus focus group or other methods that you might choose. And then finally, it's really great to think about your analysis and what you're planning to do down the line, because you want to anticipate being able to do the most appropriate analysis, particularly if you want to do analysis between groups or within groups, making sure that you have appropriate sample size and that you have the questions that will guide that analysis. All right. So I'm just going to go very quickly over the types, some of the types of questions. You know, knowledge questions can absolutely be asked qualitatively. You may be asking somebody about their awareness of a problem, an issue, or maybe even telling you their level of knowledge of a particular fact. You might want to also ask questions about attitudes and opinions. Behaviors are a great thing to ask for in qualitative research, because you can get a sense of how knowledge and attitudes may be manifesting in the behavior choices that individuals or patients are making. You can just largely examine overall perceptions. These can be really great for exploratory studies when you're trying to understand particular opinions and beliefs about something that's a pretty broad topic. You can ask people to tell you about their individual experiences, or you can even ask them to compare and contrast across different time points as well. So what do you hope to learn will help guide your question development. How is each question best answered via survey versus qualitative, and even within qualitative, the different types of approaches that you could use. And then finally, again, thinking about how you will analyze your data and how you might want to triangulate not only your different data sources, but among participants and across participants. This is just a little bit more detail in terms of thinking about that spectrum from having a very structured guide to a very unstructured one. Given time, we'd just love for you to take a look at this at a later time and really think about where you might want to fall in the continuum of having a structured versus unstructured question. And, you know, honestly, sometimes people will have, you know, kind of fall in the middle where they might have a few unstructured questions and a few structured questions where they need a little bit more detailed nuance from their participants. All right, wanted to share a guide, just a draft of something, a format that Sylvia and I have used with the students that we teach. We suggest, you know, creating somewhat of a matrix for your question guide where you clearly denote what the purpose of the question is, and then as Shazeen alluded to, opportunities for probing. And so a probe is not something where you would ask a follow-up question, but it's more an opportunity as the participant is speaking, you ask them to, you hear and listen, you're actively listening to what they're talking about. And as they mention something that's a trigger for probing, you might say, oh, you mentioned lack of resources. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Another probe might be, you mentioned struggles accessing other programs. Could you give me an example? Could you tell me more about that? So what it is it's just gently guiding the conversations. It's not interjecting. It's really carefully listening to what the participants are saying and asking them for clarification and elaboration to help get to that, I think, Shazeen, you said a richness or a depth or thickness of responses. Now, some people may feel uncomfortable with that approach and want to guide the conversation a little bit more. And you may want to consider having a prompting question. And the way that we describe using prompts is So for example, you ask an open-ended question, they mention things, you probe, but what if they don't mention something that you expected them to mention in the conversation? You may want to say before you move on, before we move on to the next question, can you describe how you are additionally impacted as a caregiver? And this was about food insecurity. And so, that's an opportunity where you say, I wanted to probe. I wanted to let the participant guide, but at the end of the day, they didn't mention that. So I wanted to ask that before I move on. So that's how we kind of would structure a question guide, giving you the opportunity to think through your interplay between very open-ended, unstructured questions and then more structured prompts as needed. All right, very quickly, super important to pilot test all your questions. There's a lot of different strategies to administer among a small population, or pilot with a stakeholder who might be familiar with your population. But it's so very critical to make sure you pilot questions to make sure you're getting the data that you're hoping to get. And again, we do have a few additional slides on some of these topics that you can reference after the presentation. All right, now I want to pass it back over to Sylvia, who will talk about preparing for analysis.
Thank you so much, Janine. As you might feel after going through the data collection process and learning about all of these interview questions or focus group questions, you might look at this and say, wow, I have a large pile of data. And I do want to sort of put in a teaser out there that we will be having a session on analysis later on in the summer. So this is just going to be an overview to give you a sense on how you might want to think about approaching this analytic process as you move forward. So here we are, large amounts of data, some are flying around. You might think to yourself, where to begin? So let's talk about some key practical steps now so that you have that in place as we move forward and thinking about the more analytic approaches. So one is, you have to have your data transformed in some way where you can analyze them. And for qualitative data, it tends to be transcriptions or some sort of written product. And if you are working with different language groups, having those audio recordings or memos or documents translated into a language that you're able to conduct analysis in. So the data tend to be some sort of digital format as a transcription, and it's something that you're able to conduct the analysis for. So you might go through a cleaning and de-identifying process. Cleaning might be something along the lines of reading through the transcripts themselves, identifying sections that were inaudible initially to the transcriptionist, and you might go back and fill in the blanks or look at your notes and your memos that you've taken. You would want to de-identify data if that is part of your protocol. And so you might look at your IRB level and determine when that might be. If people's names are mentioned, you would either create pseudonyms or create some other content, or just blank those spaces out if that were to be the case. And you would then utilize this information and input into qualitative software. We might have circumstances that you have accompanying videos and surveys, as well as transcriptions, and all of that can be conducted within the analysis process, can be conducted in a qualitative software program. We have various software programs available to us, including NVivo, Atlas TI, MaxQDA, and Janine and I primarily use Deduce. And so the next thing that you also need to do is look at your available resources as you're moving into this next phase of your research project. Now, remember, it's really exciting to talk to people and gather this information and collect that information. And really the real deep thinking comes in this next analytic process, where you might want to identify and mobilize your people around you, some people who might be co-coders in the process, people who might be content experts that you want to pull in to help better understand the phenomenon of interest. You might be working with community members who themselves will be part of the analytic process, and you want to pull them in and identify them and work together to develop your analysis plan and timeline as you move through your large quantities of data. And I promise it seems like you might think to yourself, oh, I just did 20 interviews. You have a lot of data there. So just consider that as you move forward. Next slide, please. So just to do an overview of this, for qualitative data, there is no established or standardized protocol. It's really hard to wrap our head around sometimes, but it's so dependent on how you sampled, what your research question was, what conceptual framework you're leaning on, and what are the data that you actually have collected. So this tends to be a fluid process as you create your analytic approach. And you might have to change some of those approaches as new data or new concepts emerge, or you might have a new arm of study as you reach out to new participants. So when we're looking at our analytic plan, we're considering balancing these questions of how were data collected, how are we informed by our research question, what data do we want to present and how, in what format, and then of course the meaningfulness, like how we have collected deep visceral information often from our participants in our communities. We want to be able to share that out in a meaningful and thoughtful manner that could be useful to us and as well to them. Next slide, please. Oh, and just to give you a teaser for the next few slides, this is there's multiple methods of discovery, and that starts with the coding process, but also can lend itself into the thematic or content analysis process. And these are deductive or inductive approaches, or even a combined approach. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. So we might have starting points that we might start looking at our data totally de novo, where we start in this inductive approach where we just start reading our transcripts or looking at the data that we have and start the coding process there, designing codes and code books along the way. And that is called an inductive approach. So next. When we're starting with our codes predetermined from some sort of theory or conceptual framework, we have a strong guide of what those ideas are and the definitions that come from these prior frameworks. That would be called a deductive process. So next slide. And so just to go into a little bit more detail what that looks like practically, if we start with our data and build up, we begin by developing the codes, reading the transcripts. Your codes start from the data itself, and you apply, refine the codes and the definitions, and you keep applying and refining until you have something that's stable that you can apply to the entirety of your code book. What that also means, if you're doing this in the next phase of the analysis process, your emergent themes come directly from your coded data that you then utilize and refine across your data, various different sources, as well as your participants. So is this really data-driven from your own population inductive approach, both for the coding process as well as the thematic analysis process. Next slide. When we look at the deductive approach, you really develop the codes that you're applying, or the themes that you're applying are really centered around the conceptual framework that you use from prior literature. It might be those domains of interest or something that you might map your own data onto. And that's how you might better understand how a phenomenon is being utilized or presenting itself within your community. And you apply those codes and definitions to the data. You still need to refine the approach. You still need to reapply it and make sure that it's a stable understanding of what's going on. And that process then is utilized during the coding process. But then you might also use that in the thematic analysis phase, where you use your cross-section of your coded data, apply it to the known framework, and have a better sense of map or an adaptation of your findings onto that framework. And then you might have a combined approach. You might find yourself saying, you know, I'm really drawn to this one conceptual framework to help describe a phenomenon of interest, but I see something else that's going on here. I'm allowing myself to also be drawn and inspired by the data itself and use both a deductive and an inductive approach. So just in summary, use your research question to guide your analytic approach. If you have a really exploratory or novel research project, you might want to start the coding process and then the subsequent thematic analysis process from very inductively, very viscerally from your data set. if you have some sort of prior knowledge or you have a conceptual framework that you think will help you describe the phenomenon of interest, it's more explanatory in nature, potentially a little bit further on, you might have a deductive approach. But you also can consider using this combined approach to enhance the rigor and findings of your study. And you're also able to then utilize the work that others have done as well in terms of the deductive nature of what's there to really show people how this idea or this phenomenon is applicable to the community that you're doing research with. So consider how you might approach this as you move forward and have the conceptual frameworks also be your guide if you're there, but really lean back into your research question as you move forward.
And sorry about the typo on the last page. I clearly meant to type my name, and that is not my name, as you all know. I'm really delighted to also have been awarded an MCHRI Community Engaged pilot grant earlier this year. And I had previously done qualitative research. I'm fairly new to Stanford. Some of you know me and know that I'm very proud to say that I'm Canadian and only moved to the US just over a year ago. But as I am reflecting on qualitative research, a few things I wanted to share with folks who might be similarly going through the process. So even though I had done qualitative work in Canada, I'm in a new setting. I'm in a new place. I'm in a new community. So my positionality has shifted. And it required actually quite a bit of reflection and spending time getting to know my new environment before I really felt that I was ready to start with focus groups. And I'm actually doing this later this afternoon. I had spent quite a bit of time just speaking with my community partners, trying to understand. I work with school districts that serve newcomer populations through a newcomer welcome center, and that means mostly youth who are unaccompanied and migrant youth. So I spent time understanding what language they speak, what their ages are, spending time in the actual physical space. So I knew what it might look like when I was going to set up an interview or set up a focus group. Having that community input has been very, very helpful for me, even though I had experience and skills with actually doing interviews and focus groups. I've learned that it really matters who you have doing your interviews. In one of my very first projects, I had a medical student who was wonderful do interviews. And then when I went back to look at the transcripts, because in best practice, you should be looking at the transcripts as you do interviews. The way this project had happened is that we had a bunch of interviews all at once. We looked at all the transcripts at the end, and I remember going through it and cringing because there was so much thin data where questions had been asked as a closed-ended question, which was different from the guide that we had put together, which was open-ended. And I also saw that the student got so engrossed in the stories that the participants were sharing, we got a lot of rich information that had nothing to do with the question that we were interested in. It takes a lot of time to iterate. Yes, and it totally depends if there's but sometimes it's, in this particular case, I was like, oh no, this is very helpful, but this is very interesting, but not really helpful to the question about what it's like as receiving healthcare as a newcomer. I've had to iterate a lot. So a lot of the time in quantitative research, we're sort of used to preparing one set of documents for IRB, submitting it, and then off you go. Now with qualitative research, there's a recognition that if you're using a semi-structured guide, that your questions may change as you do pilot testing, as you pilot test it out with, these might be community partners. I find community partners extremely helpful for pilot testing, how questions will land. An example of this is in Canada, we were looking at the experiences of asylum seekers. And in Canada, they have access to a type of insurance called the Interim Federal Health Program, or IFHP. But when I pilot tested the questionnaire with community partners, they said that's not at all what people on the ground actually call it. They call it the brown paper because it's physically printed on brown paper. So we changed our questionnaire to then actually refer to the brown paper instead of using that term IFHP. And I never would have thought of that if I hadn't done that testing it out. it's not easy. I think sometimes we think, oh, there's only 20 interviews. That's so much less than a 600-person, chart review. I might sometimes say it feels like more work because it's so much more iterative, and it requires, sometimes feels like I'm back in like high school English, where I'm really thinking about themes and depth and understanding. And you have to have sort of clarity of mind and space to do that. But above all, I have found it so incredibly meaningful. And I have found that the families and communities that I work with, who often don't get asked to participate, who often don't get asked to hear their stories heard, actually also find you holding space for them and intently listening and honoring what they're sharing with you deeply affirming. And so I hope those are some reflections just to share with you as someone pretty early on, but also as a grantee, and I'd love to hear from you. Those are sort of the end of our slides, and we really wanted to have some opportunities in, the next few minutes. We're around till 1:30 to hear from you and answer your questions. I know a few questions came up in the chat, so we can also go through some of those questions if we don't hear from folks, or if folks don't want to workshop or answer anything. But yeah, this is your time now.
Yeah, please feel free to. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation from the three speakers. And now I think that's a good time for you to unmute yourself and ask questions. And we will go through the question in the chat as well later. Thank you.
Hi, okay, I can go ahead and start. My name's Angela Castellanos. I'm a pediatric hospitalist in the general pediatrics division. I'm actually working, I just finished my fellowship at Boston Children's, and I'm working on a qualitative study there. I think when I started qualitative research, I wasn't as familiar with like starting with the conceptual model. And so I was wondering if you all had kind of thoughts on how to get started on conceptual models, how to, I don't know if it's workshopping or kind of just general approaches to developing conceptual models, or even like a paper that has reference to that. That'd be helpful. Thank you.
I'm happy to start from our team. Yeah, so maybe give me an example of like what it is that you're like the conceptual model that you're aiming to study.
I guess that's kind of, so the project I'm doing is looking at developing trust between Spanish-speaking patients and inpatient providers. So I think obviously we would start with looking at other papers that have looked at developing trust and things like that, but I don't know. I think this idea is new to me, this like building a conceptual model. So even just how to,
Yeah. So I'll start from that, and then my colleagues can jump in, and of course the audience too. This is some of the work that I've done in the past has been to do with trust building and trustworthiness, and so obviously I look to first the literature, see if there's anything that strikes me in terms of the direction and the dimensions that I want to study with related trust. Trust is very big, but honestly the second thing that I do is actually just put in trust, patients and providers, and then I put in conceptual framework into a Google search bar, and I look at images, and I really look at and that's where I see sort of like where others are thinking about this dimension, and I'm able to quickly review 20 to 30 very quickly and be able to say, I want to hone in this area, I want to hone in this other area. And then I look, of course, I look to the primary literature of those figures and to see where they're inspired, start looking at the definitions and identifying if those are the areas of trust in the trust building that I'm looking for. And if there's anything that has language concordance issues or non-concordance issues, I would look at those papers more specifically as well. But I think there's a lot in the field of trust. And it's not just trust within the healthcare setting. You can also look outside of your own discipline, which we often don't do. I am at fault for that myself. So I have to remind myself and others, we can start looking at other fields of study for for these big ideas. And again, the benefit of a shared definition, like you're not trying to reinvent what trust is. Others are giving you some language and you're just seeing how that's applied in your population, is such a huge relief. I find it people are so excited when they finally see the conceptual framework that they're so excited about it. It's like whew, this is it. They get excited and relieved at the same time. But I'll let Janine and Shazeen chime in.
No,
Go ahead,
oh,
Janine.
no, you go ahead.
So I had two thoughts. So well, I have three thoughts. My first thought is, Angela, when I was learning in graduate school qualitative methods, the course I hated the most was on conceptual frameworks. And I remember struggling so hard with it. And now I'm like, oh, I get it. It's just a way to it's something to anchor all your questions on. So it's not like you're randomly asking questions, right? And sometimes it means that you are actually creating a conceptual framework and you can borrow from existing constructs. So I remember one of the biggest aha moments I had was when my professor at Hopkins said, you know, you can take constructs from social cognitive theory and the theory of planned behavior and make your own conceptual model of what is happening. And that I think I use quite a bit when something doesn't exactly perfectly fit, but you find something and then adapt. And then I shared with you one of my favorite resources. It's called Theory at a Glance. It goes through a lot of health behavior change conceptual models, which I think applies to many of us who are interested in clinical research because a lot of what we're talking about are behaviors. So I hope you like it. I find I still use it. I send it to all my students and it's helped me come up with concepts. Janine, over to you.
Oh, that was perfect. I couldn't have said it better. The only thing I would add is that, you know, don't feel like the framework can be an opportunity to help organize your thoughts, anchor your work in things that others have thought about. But also, there may not be every element or all of the constructs that might be in a particular framework. You don't have to use all of them. You can say this study is looking at this specific piece. We acknowledge that there is a whole other element to this larger idea, but for this present study, we're looking at this piece. So that can be a little liberating to say, I can't explore everything, or everything's not relevant to this particular study. Or as Shazeen said, maybe combining a couple different ideas together. And then always feel free to say, you know what, this framework is like 90% perfect, but it does not include this element that's very specific to my context or population. And then you would add that into your guide.
And I remembered my actual third thought, Angela. I think this is also where working with people who have lived experiences on the topic that you're trying to address can really help you flesh that out. And so that could be called, you know, community engagement or having an advisory board. For example, it might be so helpful to have co-researchers who are actually parents or patients themselves who are Spanish speaking, and again, Spanish speaking is not monolithic, right? There's a whole variety of cultures. And I think trust is something that's really rooted in social norms and cultural norms. So definitely look at that social cognitive theory for your study. But that can also absolutely like completely shift your project into something more meaningful when you have the engagement of people who are lived. And we're doing a session on community advisory boards and how to set one up and work with them in June. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Other questions? I see a few people came off or came on video.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vivian Sun. I'm a peds hospitalist. I just had a question. I think a lot of your tips around how to facilitate focus groups seem to have been in person, like having, you know, being in the same physical space. And I think there are now a lot of focus groups, including my project, on Zoom. And if you have any specific tips around like facilitating on Zoom, like one common issue that has come up for me is that like people seem to wait for the moderator to say something before they'll speak to another participant. Like the whole process of unmuting, I think, has been more of like a hurdle, I think. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on Zoom format and any best practices there.
I can start by sharing some reflections, Janine, and then Sylvia, I'll pass it to you. So my very meta response is that I do think you get a different quality of interaction when you're, depending on your environment. So even physically, if you're on site at a community agency where all the people are comfortable versus if you make them go to a different site to be part of a focus group, you're going to get a different quality of environment. And that should be acknowledged either in a reflexivity section or in your limitations of how that might have influenced what you see. So that's like my big caveat. When I work with Zoom, and you can imagine with a lot of young people, they like to work on Zoom a lot, and I do focus groups with youth. The youngest focus group I've ever done was kindergartners, and it was one of the best focus groups I ever did. They answered questions so well, way better than their grown-ups counterparts, just saying, for that study. But with young people, part of the first part of your focus group is actually like ice breaking and opening questions. And I would actually spend a big, like you usually can do a focus group for about 60 to 90 minutes. I would spend a lot of that time at the beginning doing introductions, co-creating ground rules together, including how you want to communicate, and then having some questions that are not necessarily super related to your topic, but easy, fun questions for people to talk about. So for example, if I'm talking to youth about their experiences after first arriving in the US with healthcare, my opening question might be like, what's your favorite food since moving here? You know, what's been your favorite thing to do? And all it does is get people comfortable with talking and get people comfortable with the process of whatever they've decided on as a group, whether it's raising their hand or responding to each other. And that will help the flow of your conversation a little bit more. So those are some quick tips. But also in your ground rules is like, are we going to put our hand up? Are we just going to unmute? The hand up seems to really work a lot, whether it's physically opening a hand up. And then as a facilitator, you can kind of help direct that. But it's and I would do the same thing in an in-person facilitation too. Janine or Sylvia, I don't know if you wanted to add some more.
Oh, I would just add that, you know, I think it's going to be really important for you as a facilitator to, you'll probably have to prompt more people, and you'll probably have to have more opportunities where, because the conversation may stall a little, where you're going to say, you know, want to give everybody the opportunity to chime in. You may direct it to a particular individual. I personally think it would be very hard to do a focus group if people weren't on camera. So you'll have to decide to what degree that's important. A lot of people don't like to be on camera, but I think you totally lose the group dynamics. And then the last thing I would say, or two last things I would say, one is just acknowledge you may not get what you are hoping for in the online format. You may totally, depending on the participants, but if you don't, think about what else you might do. Might you want to follow up with interviews with a subset of those participants to really make sure you get more richness in data? You know, just be open to that or other forms of data collection that could be analyzed in conjunction with your focus groups as well. And then lastly, we are learning more about, you know, just having to be really careful, particularly with how Zoom type opportunities are advertised. Sometimes things get posted a little bit more publicly than you anticipate. And if that's the case, you have to be really careful of Zoom bombing. Our dear own Dr. Bonnie Halpern-Flesher, who is an absolute guru in qualitative research, has had some recent issues. But, you know, do you need to have waiting rooms? Do you need to have people, you know, it's real when you're sending out a link versus asking somebody to come to a room.
Yeah. And I would add, you know, there's a reason to have things potentially on Zoom or digitally or it provides people more anonymity. And that could be a benefit to some research questions and some things that you want to find out, right? Like you may not want to see someone's background or their faces, and they may not want to share that information to others as well, right? If their names are not present and their faces are not there, because there is something in an in-person interview where you do have the nonverbal cues, right? And if you might want to preserve that, there are benefits to Zoom, but you have to really work hard, right, to pull information from people, constantly remind them, we're here to learn from you. Like we're not we want you to share how comfortable you are, everything, keep reminding this is anonymous, this is de-identified, this is etc. And as Janine had mentioned before, like you need to just be comfortable with the pause, right? And just sit there like I'm here to listen, and I want to sort of create this shared space, and I'm going to take a sip of tea, and I want you to sort of take a breath and share as you can.
Yeah. Thank you, Shazeen and Janine and Sylvia. And we do have one more question on chat as asked by the attendees. Can you speak to interviewer and buyers, and how much leeway does the interviewer have to confirm or affirm the interviewee feelings? I know, Janine, you provide some response to Zoom through on the chat already. If anyone want to add more.
As you saw, this is one of my favorite questions.
Good.
And I'm going to say something that may sound controversial. So in quantitative data, we often are looking for an objective truth, right? We're looking for something that is objective, completely devoid of bias. But if I hold my cup up in front of you and I ask you to describe what you are seeing on the cup, you might say, I see a white cup with words. And I might say, well, I don't see any words. Which one of us is right? The answer is both of us are right. And so that means both of us, our perspectives, whatever I'm sharing with you is absolutely going to be colored by the lens in which I experience the world. And so it is impossible to have a qualitative study completely devoid of bias, because the way in which we approach our work is absolutely influenced by the way in which I exist in the world. And that is why that concept of reflexivity is so important in qualitative research. In fact, in good journal articles, you will see in the methods, and I certainly try to do this myself, there's a reflexivity paragraph where you talk about that. I would say I'm a racialized Muslim female whose family came as refugees. That is absolutely going to influence the work that I do with immigrant families. But I'm also English speaking, and I also am a physician, and that might influence the way families approach me. And so the most important thing is that we take the time to actually candidly reflect on that positionality and how that might influence how we are asking questions, how we are receiving information, and vice versa, how someone might be receiving a question from us and how that question might be internalized by them. When you're doing your analysis, it is so important that you do something called bracketing, which is why, unlike, quantitative data, sometimes I could be like, oh, I have an hour, I'm just going to quickly sit down and, do some data crunching. It is very different for me with qualitative data. I have to make sure I have no distractions. I have actually taken a little bit of time to kind of center myself, reflect on what the purpose of the work is. Where am I coming from right now? What are the other things on my mind? What are the things that have got me emotionally riled up? And really reflect on it and put it aside so that I can actually have the words tell me what they mean without, as much as possible, without those other pieces interfering. So this is why it's one of my favorite questions, because it doesn't have a perfect, succinct answer, but the devil is in the details of how you approach that. And I saw Janine and Sylvia nodding, so I feel like I'm on the right track, but that they agree. So I'd love to hear what their thoughts are.
No, you go ahead, Sylvia.
I read the question differently. But I love your answer to the answer to the
That's
question.
why we have different perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. And I was reflecting on my experiences. I'm not a physician, but I work in the School of Medicine. I work a lot with healthcare professionals, either in training or in practice, as well as patients. And so when the types of questions that I tend to ask in interviews and focus groups tend to be about like professional development and training. And as someone who's not a physician, I have to probe and pry a little bit more. And some people might not know that I'm not a clinician, right? And so some people feel judged sometimes about their clinical choices, or patients ask me, what would they do in this situation? They're asking me for professional clinical advice. And I have to set the stage. I have to remind myself to set the stage that I am not here to judge you. I'm here to learn about this experience. I'm actually not capable of providing any clinical advice, whether or not we're in this research setting, which is not okay to do, right? And I have to, this is where practicing your pilot testing your questions is really useful, where I need to sort of step back and have pre-phrased language in my head and hearing more about people and saying, tell me more about that. I see that you're upset. I see that you're angry, right? It's a little bit of a fine line, because often these interviews tend to be therapeutic in some way, whether or not it's a sensitive topic. People like to talk about things a lot. And so you just sort of understand that you're being pulled in to gather data, but you're also needing to sort of check yourself a little bit sometimes in terms of like your own excitement and direction of how their questions and the data are flowing. I think that was a different dimension to what Shazeen's talking about.
And thanks. And then we do have a more question coming in. Like one question, I think is a great question. If you do interviews in Spanish, but plan on publishing in English and have staff that speak both to varying degrees, what language would you recommend coding in? Is there any problem other than logistical with some folks coding in Spanish and some in English? Very practical questions.
Sure, I'll jump in. Hello, Lily. Great to see you again. I think that if you have a team that can, I know Lily well, because I think if you have a team that could code in Spanish, there's no reason why you would want to translate everything, because it's actually going to be a very small number of codes or quotes that actually make it into a final manuscript. So if you can maintain some of the context and nuance that can be lost in the translation before you do the coding, I think you would be better off, especially if the team can do that. And then for the very few number of codes that quotes that actually make it into your manuscript, you can have a really thoughtful process of making sure that they're translated, reviewed multiple times for accuracy by the team, to make sure you lose as little of the nuance as possible.
So in my work, and we often think about English and Spanish, but I want to answer your question as if it was a language other than English, because certainly when I work with migrant communities, like I shared in the chat, I have a study right now looking at barriers and facilitators to engagement in research for newcomer families with young children. And we've done 34 interviews with caregivers and care providers, and in 14 languages other than English. Intentionally, because we know those voices are often underrepresented. And so just to echo what Janine said, it's helpful to have a multilingual team. That's so great that you have that. And then I sort of do the forward and back translation. So if it's been done in Spanish or in French or a different language, you translate it into English, but have the person who is multilingual listen to the interviewer and make sure it was translated appropriately and word for word. And then you can do that all at the beginning when you're coding, so that when you prepare your manuscript, it can be prepared in English. And that does speak to a bias, and like the publication bias, that we do publish everything in English. And that's a whole separate conversation when we want to talk about research equity and other things.
Awesome. Thanks, Young.
Thank you. Any other questions? More questions?
Hi. Hello.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name is Chioma Iwabuchi, and I am in the main building of 500 on L5 Neuroscience Epilepsy Unit. I'm starting to do some research on the stigma of epilepsy. Originally, we want to focus into the African American community. We're not sure how many we can get from Stanford, so we may or may not just make it more of a general topic and then focus later when we can. But my question was about more of like, is there, when we have to make brochures, after I do my qualitative questionnaires and get that data, we wanted to make like an informational brochure to disseminate to the patients about stigma, internal stigmas, and then do another qualitative questionnaire on like how that brochure helped, facilitate their knowledge. So is there a framework that I need to use when I am building an informational brochure to inform patients about those kind of things, about educating them on stigmas?
I think you can use actually some of those health behavior change frameworks to say, like, what are the barriers and facilitators to education? What are the cultural norms? And once you've put that anchor on, it will help you know what are the pieces you need to put on your flyer. And I would also really encourage, maybe this is a great project to have a community advisory board component where you actually have, again, folks with lived experiences who can then look at what the conceptual model you've created and the flyer and see if that actually maps on accurately. But check out the link. I think that might actually really help.
Okay, thank you so much.
Problem. Do you want me to send it again? I sent it earlier in the chat.
Oh, you did? Oh, yeah, maybe I didn't see
I'll
it.
put it in the chat, and I'm also happy to chat offline if that's helpful. But
oh, yeah, how can I do that?
Well, I'll let first Janine and Sylvia answer, but I'm sure all of us are happy to chat offline if folks need.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But just the one thing I would add is it's not quite so much about frameworks, but how you go about designing such a study. So it's you might do multiple different trials of different pieces of information and how people intake information. And that could be, brochures and even just what's information's on the brochures, when it's provided, who provides it. So that's a little bit of an earlier step than even the creation, like identification of this is an earlier step than the creation of a final product. So I would just recommend going through it and thinking a little bit upstream as well, as you're designing this intervention, to think about what's acceptable to people and what format, what literacy level, what languages, etc.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. Any more questions here? Feel free to unmute yourself or put a question on the chat. I try to practice my focus group skills like silence, like give people time to respond.
I love it, Dongmei.
All right. If
Yes.
not,
I
okay,
wanted to
go
jump in and say, was there anything that was confusing or something that you want us to have a deeper dive into in future sessions? This is a good opportunity for feedback to us as well.
Yeah. Great. Okay, thank you so much everyone for joining the seminar today, and particular thanks to the 3 amazing presenters. And then I know a lot of people like kind of check me and ask like when the recording will be posted, and then I will maybe have Netta to answer this question, but definitely the recording will be posted on our MCHRI seminar website, and then Netta will also going to send out the PDF slides so you can have it for your information in the future. And then we will have an upcoming seminar in June for the community advisory board topic. And then in August, we will have one focus on how to analyze qualitative research data. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.